Good evening, and welcome to Restored Lore, your home for old, odd, and obscure stories. Tonight we continue our holiday reading of Tinsley's 1869 Christmas annual, 13 at Table, the story of a dinner that was never eaten. The story plays out a bit like an old-fashioned murder mystery. 13 people receive unexpected letters inviting them to the reading of a will and the distribution of an inheritance. The characters are wildly different, and each part of the story explains the character and their backstory as they take this sudden journey. This is the 6th video in the series. If you haven't listened to the first part, you can use the link on screen now or in the description below to get caught up. Because each part describes a different character, they don't have to be listened to in order, but the first part provides the context for what follows. No spoilers, but this installment continues the core narrative established at the beginning. If you are going to speedrun this series, the must-watch videos are 1, 6, and 7. Now, let's open our imaginations and begin. Of a small boy who came from old Tushers. It is to be supposed that everybody, or very nearly, knows old Tusher. Of course, all boys know him, but for the benefit of a few grown-up people, a dreadfully ignorant class with a deal of pretense about them, it may be as well to mention that old Tusher kept a jolly big school down in Yorkshire and made a jolly good thing of it, thank you for nothing. Now, probably when you hear that old Tusher's school was in Yorkshire, you will run your head against the idea that it was something like Squeers that you may have heard of in a book called Nicholas Nickleby, but it just wasn't. Old Tusher went in for quite another line of business. They starved the boys at Squeers, but they feasted them at Tusher's. At Squeers they spoilt their appetites with brimstone and treacle. They gave you tonics at Tusher's. You had just as many helps at dinner as ever you could get through, and you rather caught it warm if you didn't clear your plate up pretty clean. Why, bless you, at Squeers they only had meat once a week at the outside, but at Tusher's you had a choice of joints every day, all the year round, besides all sorts of pies and puddings and tarts and blancmanges, till you got regularly right down tired of the lot of them. Added to this, the lesson part of the business was nothing better than a game of larks, and all the masters were such awful fools you could crib what you had got to from a book right under their very noses. Perhaps you'd hardly believe there was such a jolly place to call a school, but you may take it for granted, whether you believe it or not, that this statement is not only probable, but likely, and, what is more to the purpose, it happens also to be a fact. And why do you suppose old Tusher carried on a school in this extraordinarily liberal style? Why, because he found it answer. He only took rich boys, that is to say, boys with rich parents, and when a boy came he never wanted to go away again. Why, talk of holidays, Tusher's boys used to cry when the holiday time came, and returned to school quite thin and wasted when it was over. So you see, don't you, the boys all pleased their friends by liking school so much, and though they did not exactly make all the progress they might have done, taking the cost into consideration, yet it was to a certain extent very gratifying to see that they were so willing to go on learning. Well, you see, there was a boy at old Tusher's called Welch, who was Tusher's favorite pupil, and the richest boy of the whole lot. At least, so it was thought, until certain circumstances transpired, of which the following is a true relation. One wild and windy night, a man in a cloak came down to Yorkshire by a mail train that ran off the rails and was smashed up about 1/4 of a mile from old Tusher's house. Old Tusher and some of the boys heard the noise from the garden and went down with lanterns to see what assistance they could render the travelers. They found the gentleman in the cloak a good deal shaken, and a little boy, 8 years old, whom he had with him more shaken still. The name of the man in the cloak was Welch. He was a captain, and had just come from India. The little boy was his son, and he was the rich pupil before mentioned. You probably never came across so agreeable a man and such a fine gentleman as Captain Welch, nor one with such long mustaches. Old Tusher asked the captain to stop all night, which he did, and praised the bedroom and the supper and everything Tusher showed him, and vowed he would like to have been a boy again himself and come to school there, although at home in India he had ever so many elephants in his stables, just as Her Majesty Queen Victoria has horses in hers, and the greater part of the captain's elephants were white ones. Well, the end of it was that the captain went away and left his little boy behind him, and next day Tusher told all the other boys that the new pupil was a millionaire, and that we had better mind what we said before him about our families, as young Welch had been brought up with very elevated notions, which the comic boy of the school said was probably because he'd been brought up on an elephant. But, bless you, young Welch wasn't a bit proud. He fell to on old Tusher's victuals just as if he'd never had anything half as good to eat before in his life. He didn't say much because he didn't know more than 20 words of English, and so the other boys couldn't get such accurate accounts of the elephant stables as they would have desired. But by his pantomime he seemed to indicate that elephants generally, if not Captain Welch's particular elephants, were uncommonly large animals. Meanwhile, old Tusher went on singing his praises, and his father's praises, and the praises of Welch's home in Calcutta, and all the other boys, when they wrote to their parents, filled at least 2 sides of their letters with Captain Welch's elephants, and could hardly get them in even then. But that wasn't all. Old Tusher had a daughter who was already double young Welch's age, but it was currently reported that she was to be saved up for young Welch, and that in another dozen years or so bestow her hand upon him in marriage. And years rolled on, and young Welch still continued to be the richest boy in the school, and had ever so much more pocket money than any other, and was also taught all the extras, which were musical instruments, out-of-door sketching, and gymnastics, the sketching being about the biggest lark you ever heard of, as a fellow had only to pretend to lose his pencil, and he could go nutting, or lie on his back, and not have to do any work at all if he didn't want to, which of course he didn't. By this time, more years having rolled on, young Welch got to be 11.5 years of age, and then a very surprising circumstance occurred respecting him. Everybody had always thought it rather funny, you must know, that young Welch's father never wrote to him, although old Tusher said he received letters regularly from India. They never contained any enclosure for the son. Now, one day 2 or 3 of the boys were in the pleasure grounds near the outer gate when the postman came and, contrary to rules, took in the letters, or letter rather, for there was only one, and this one was for young Welch. Says the postman who brought the letter, "This here's overweight, there's 10 pence to pay." "How's that?" says young Welch. "It's not a very big one." "Heavy, though," says the postman. "There's money inside." "Here's a shilling for you, my man," says young Welch. He always had a free and easy way with him, as the son of the owner of a stable full of white elephants ought to have. "And you can keep the 2 pence yourself for a glass of beer." Well, when the postman had gone away, young Welch puts on an air of letters being quite an everyday sort of thing to him, and opens it very carelessly, so that the money inside slipped through his fingers and fell to the ground. "Hullo," says someone. "I'm blessed if young Welch hasn't paid 10 pence for a shilling." At this, as everybody laughed out, young Welch blushed up a little and said, "Who the deuce could have sent it me?" and then began to read. The other fellows watched his countenance as he did so, and saw that at first he was much surprised, and then very angry, and then very crestfallen, and when he had finished he turned away and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He did not say anything, however, but went straight up to the house to ask for old Tusher, and he and old Tusher had a long talk of it shut up by themselves, and no one allowed to interfere. Later on in the evening, in the twilight time, the boys, looking through one of the schoolroom windows, saw old Tusher and young Welch walking up and down on the grass plot, and more than once old Tusher stopped to pat young Welch upon the head or on the back, as it seemed, to comfort him. At supper he sat next to old Tusher and had all the primest tidbits, but he did not eat very much, and looked uncommonly pale and pitiful, and the fellow who slept in the next bed woke up and heard him crying during the night. But in the morning he said nothing of what had happened, although, as may be supposed, everyone was dying to know all about it. As he kept on saying nothing, however, and kept on keeping on, all the other fellows got rather impatient, and one fellow up and asked him at last right out if there was anything wrong with the elephants. You never saw anyone blush up as young Welch did then, and to the amazement of all the assembly he replied, "There are none." As soon as the readiest fellow had found breath enough to speak, he asked, "Since when?" "Since always," replied young Welch. "Then," continued the readiest boy, "have there never been none?" "No," was young Welch's memorable reply, and he burst out crying. But here old Tusher happened to come to the rescue, and the conversation ceased. That very night a fellow who owed young Welch a grudge, but it was a nasty, mean thing to do, found out where he had hid the letter he had received, and read it, and reported the contents to all the school. It was a remarkable letter. There were texts in parts of it, and in other parts bad language, where the writer had said he had been ruined by a deuced villain. It began, "My dear son," and ended, "Your affectionate and miserable father, Arthur Welch." It said in one place, "I hope old Tusher treats you well. He's a shabby old cuss, and has not acted as he ought to have done by me, as an officer and a gentleman, knowing that it was no fault of mine. My acceptances were not duly honored, but he has given me his promise you shan't want. My dear boy, pick up all the learning you can, for it may be useful to you, and try and stand well with those among your schoolfellows who are of good family and well connected. Pray also avoid intemperance and billiards." Young Welch was 11 1/2, "which, with the machinations of deuced scoundrels, have been your poor father's ruin." There was a P.S. about the shilling, which was quite pathetic. "I enclose a trifle for you, my dear boy. It will deprive your father of a day's food, but no matter. I shall be comforted with the thought that it will make my son's heart glad." Then there followed a text. When the boys had heard all this and talked it well over, they came to one conclusion, and that was that Captain Welch, who did not live in India, he dated from America, and had never kept any elephants, not even of the ordinary color, was no better than an old humbug. But then came the puzzling part. Who found young Welch's pocket money and paid for his board, lodging, lessons, and extras? This occupied everybody for a long while, and even when it had been thought well over, no solution could be found until the fellow that read the first letter read a part of one young Welch wrote in answer. It was a disgusting trick, that, and he had his head punched for it in due course, as you will see. The part of the answer he read ran thus: "Dear Father, I was very happy to hear from you and hope you are quite well. As it leaves me at present, I am very sorry you are so poor, and wish you had not sent me the shilling, and I am afraid I have been very wicked to waste so much money myself, but I did not know Mr. Tusher and Miss Tusher are very good and kind to me, and treat me better than the parlor boarders, but they never said you had not enough to eat or had no elephants. But, my dear father, I am not happy any longer since I heard of it, and I can't help thinking how hungry you must be, and please may I come to you in the holidays, and I am sure Mr. Tusher would let me bring an hamper. But I would rather not stop here any longer, if you please, dear father, because I have been thinking if I do I am only a beggar, and living on charity like at an almshouse or that sort of thing." Now when the news got about that young Welch was, as he put it, only a charity boy, and not the richest fellow that ever was, as that jolly old humbug Tusher wanted to have everybody believe, there was naturally a good deal of indignation upon the subject, because all the other boys' fathers were respectable, and paid a pot of money for all their sons got in the extra way, and it was hardly fair to thrust a fellow who was nothing but a charity boy before everybody else, and a pack of elephants that never existed at all down everybody's throat. and so some of the boys did not wait long before they let young Welch know they did not think him quite all the everlasting swell he had thought himself, and he got cut a good deal and sent to Coventry and struck out of the cricket club. Besides this, the boys who used to ask him to go and see them during the holidays wrote home about it, and the parents wrote to old Tusher and said they understood that old Tusher was harboring the son of a disreputable person, and if he continued to do so, their sons would be taken away. After this, some of the sons were taken away, because old Tusher stuck out, and all the other fellows cut young Welch dead, and young Welch was jolly miserable, one of the jolly miserablest young beggars, in fact, that ever was born. When things had gone on in this jolly unpleasant fashion for 6 months or so, there came another letter about young Welch. You will think that this story is all about letters, but this one was not from the captain, but from a lawyer or solicitor, it does not signify which in this instance, who wrote to the following effect, only with lots of legal technicalities which don't particularly matter, and old Tusher read the letter out loud to the assembled school. "Dear Sir," it said, meaning young Welch, aged 11 3/4. "I have to inform you that, in pursuance of a codicil in the will of the late Mr. White, of Riverside, Low Tide Street, West Strand, who died on the 25th December last, you are requested to attend at the residence of the deceased on the 31st of January next, at 6 o'clock in the evening precisely, to receive your share of £20,000 18s. 3d, being the estimated amount of the said Mr. White's property, as left by him at the date of his death, after deducting necessary legal expenses, house rent, housekeeper's wages, etc." "And I have read this letter in public," said old Tusher, "so that it may be well known in this school that Master Welch will very shortly inherit his share of the vast property left to him by his deceased relative." A great astonishment set in among the other boys after this, but one fellow, who always had his wits about him, jumped up and sang out, "3 cheers for young Welch!" And when they were given, another boy sang out also, "Please, sir, may we have a half-holiday?" Which old Tusher gave them right off, as was his custom, upon all anniversaries, boys' birthdays, and such like, so that an artful boy once had 2 birthdays in the same half, and pretended he had forgotten when old Tusher found him out. All that afternoon every boy was speculating as to how much young Welch's share was likely to come to, and supposing there were more than 3 shares, how they would manage about the odd 3d, toss up or once, but it was generally agreed that even without the 3d young Welch would make a very fine thing of it, unless, as that fellow who read Welch's letters on the sly suggested, there should be a couple of hundreds or so of other people to share the money. But this was manifestly such rubbish, and said so spitefully, he got his head punched right off on the spot. After this there was a kind of general jubilee, seed cake and plum jam for tea, no lessons to learn at night, but hot elderberry wine, and toasts and sentiments, and the 3 jolly post boys by the comic boy, with a regular right-down roaring chorus. Next day everybody wrote home about the fortune young Welch was coming into, and some of them made it out even bigger than it was by putting down a not too many, but as the comic boy, he was an awful fool, yet you couldn't help laughing, said, it was only 2 knots short of 2 millions, and, after all, a knot is nothing. From that time forward young Welch went back to his place as the richest boy of the school, and everybody began debating as to what he was likely to do when he came into his property, and whether there was any chance of his marrying Miss Tusher when he had grown up enough, and going into a partnership with old T. From that time forward there was no other topic of conversation which could at all compare with this one, except perhaps it was the approaching holidays, to which everybody was looking forward with some misgivings, as generally in the holiday time a fellow got bustled up a goodish bit about how he had been getting on with his learning, and all that stuff, last half. During the Christmas holidays you may be sure the subject was discussed by the various boys' families, and when the jolly day came to go back to school again, all the boys returned in a state of great excitement, just in time to see young Welch off to London. There was a grand supper and speeches overnight, and a half-holiday in the morning to see him to the station, for he was obliged to go by himself, owing to old Tusher being taken suddenly with the gout, and every boy hurrayed him with all the power of his lungs upon the platform, at which the other travellers were probably a good deal surprised. And perhaps it was this incident which led to the extraordinary amount of attention being paid to young Welch upon his journey into town. In the first place, however, it must be understood that Mrs. Tusher had given half a crown to the guard, and told him to be particularly careful with young Welch, as he was coming into a large property, and was then on his way to London to step into it. This information the guard in question conveyed to another guard, who came and had a look at young Welch from various points of view through the carriage window. At every station where they stopped, the first guard kept his eye on young Welch, as though he thought he would get out of coming into his property if he only got a chance, and run away. And when they reached the journey's end, he kept his eye on him still, and his hand on his collar, for it had been arranged between him and Mrs. Tusher that young Welch should not be lost sight of, but delivered safely at Mr. White's house that evening, so that he might be taken care of until 6 o'clock the next evening. But while he had been keeping one eye on young Welch, he had yet had time to wet the other, metaphorically speaking, and by the time they reached London, the guard had just drunk such an amount of one thing and another that he felt it to be absolutely imperative he should quench his thirst with a little of something else. Still keeping one eye on young Welch, he took that young gentleman into the first public-house he came to, and called for warm whiskey. Whilst drinking it, he got talking to another man, who was having some warm gin, and he told the warm gin man how young Welch had come into a little matter of 20 million, and the warm gin man said he didn't believe it, and the guard swore it was true, and the warm gin man said it was a lie, with emphasis, and then they stepped outside and pulled off their coats. Now, while they were fighting, young Welch was very much frightened, for a mob of roughs had collected and pushed him to and fro, and he ran away down the street and round the corner. But when he would have retraced his steps, he found he had lost his way. He wandered about for quite 2 hours looking for the public-house, but though he found several other public-houses that were as like it as 2 peas, he could not find the right one, and the more he searched, the farther he got away from it. At last he stopped short in a quiet little back street, and pulled out his watch to see the time. While he was looking at it, however, a hand with long fingers came round from the back of him and closed upon it, and another hand grasped his throat and squeezed it so tightly he was half suffocated. Next moment he came down with a great crack on the back of his head, and lay for some moments stunned. An old gentleman in rather ragged clothes and flavored by various unpleasant odors, such as tobacco and onions and stale liquor, came to raise him, and as he was for a few minutes unable to answer any questions, felt for his, young Welch's, card in the waistcoat pocket, where young Welch generally carried his portemonnaie. But as it was not there, either the person who had taken the watch or someone else must have taken that also. The ragged old gentleman, however, had a particular appointment to keep, and could not stay any longer to help young Welch to find the thief, and so, as he did not know what to do himself, he only cried and walked away. But he was desperately tired by this time, and very hungry, and he thought the best thing he could do would be to find out Mr. White's house, and he began to make inquiries. It was now nearly midnight, and he was right at the other end of London, but by dint of perseverance he came at length to Low Tide Street, and found the house, and pulled loudly at the bell. There was no notice taken of him for a long while. Then a female head with a frilled nightcap on it was protruded from one of the upper windows, and a voice asked, "Who's there?" "Oh, if you please," said young Welch, "it's me." "Who are you?" inquired the frilled nightcap. "Oh, if you please, I'm come for the money."
"What money?"
"The money that was left me."
"There's no money that I know of. Where'd you come from?"
"Oh, if you please, I'm from Mr. Tusher's."
"From whose's?"
"From Tusher's."
"What Tusher is that?"
"Well,
"There's only one Mr. Tusher that I know of, ma'am," replied young Welch, "and he's in Yorkshire." "Has he sent you from there this evening, then?"
"Yes, ma'am."
"Then," said the lady above, "you better tusher yourself off back again from where you came from, or I shall tusher a jug of cold water atop of you pretty sharply."
Then the frilled nightcap disappeared, and the window was slammed down, and young Welch was left disconsolate, and it began to rain. He wandered about through the night, and walked very many weary miles, and was not a little scared by the sights he saw. He came in his rambles upon poor shivering creatures huddled upon the seats in the park, and others crowded together under archways and down dark passages. He sat down himself once and tried to go to sleep, but it was so bitterly cold he could not. The look of some of the other night wanderers half frightened him out of his wits, and once or twice a policeman, noticing that he wore good clothes, turned round and eyed him suspiciously, on which occasions he ran away again faster than ever. But at length, about 5 o'clock in the morning, he found his way back to the railway station, and there met the very guard who had had charge of him, and who was mightily pleased to see him again. And so, later on in the day, he reached his journey's end without further mishap. Of the 14th Person, who was no better than he need have been. Richard White, Jr., Esquire, commonly known as Dick White, soon after leaving his father in dudgeon, made a discovery. It was not a discovery likely to prove of advantage to him. On the contrary, it threatened to be very inconvenient and to give him a considerable amount of trouble. It was the discovery of a possession. Certainly he had before this had some inkling of the fact, from occasional headaches, with now and then a furred tongue, but it was only on the next day after quarrelling with his father that Dick White, for the first time in his life, thoroughly realized the fact that he had a stomach. No, Dick White did not care a fig for anatomy or any other science, unless it was the branch of mathematics relating to the measurement of angles. It may sound strange, but it is none the less true, that Dick White had made quite a study of acute, right, and obtuse angles. He could discourse learnedly upon the angle of incidence and the angle of reflection, but the anomaly is easily explained, since Dick White was a member of the Board of Green Cloth, known in common parlance as a billiard table, and Dick's angular studies were made with a lancewood cue for a pen. His lines were drawn with a round ivory ball, and his angles were made by the aid of the table's patent india-rubber cushions. But, apropos of Richard White's stomach. Heretofore, in consequence of much smoking and potations large, hunger was a pain that had never troubled him. But now he awoke to the consciousness that without money one cannot eat, and that eat he must to live. In fact, just then, from having gone to bed perfectly sober, Richard White had awakened with a fine appetite, whose edge he could not even take off with the Indian weed, for pouch and cigar case were perfectly empty. After leaving his offended parent, he had visited a billiard table in the Strand, where he had, with great difficulty, picked up enough to pay for his bed, but, on engaging with a stranger, a tall, aristocratic-looking gentleman with a great deal of jewellery about his person, Dick discovered that he had met his match. And after some hours' hard fighting, he was merely the winner of a few shillings, which the aristocratic stranger frankly owned himself unable to pay, affording Dick the satisfaction of knowing that the new friend who fraternized with him so warmly was as penniless as himself. "Well," said Dick, in a dignified way, "sooner than not pay my debts of honor, I think I should solicit the aid of my uncle," and he pointed to the stranger's elaborate locket and chain. "Exactly," said the other, winking with great freedom, for he had taken stock of his adversary. "But you see, my dear fellow, he would not take them. In fact, if he did, it would be reverse of circumstances, and I should be taking him in. Do you see?" Dick White did see, and muttering something about its never raining without it poured, he departed and obtained a bed at a neighboring hotel, and had as much of it as he possibly could for his money, and went away in the morning to the great disgust of waiter, boots, and chambermaid, who did not fail to express their opinions respecting seedy swells who didn't ought to be allowed to have beds in respectable hotels. We seem to keep running away from our subject, and that is precisely what Dick White essayed to do, but in vain. His forgetfulness was always swept away by a sharp pang of hunger, and again angrily he asked himself what he should do. Certainly there was an unsatisfactory kind of food whereof he might have eaten and been filled, but, hungry as he was, Dick would not stoop to eat humble pie. And, seeking a place for cogitation and the solving of the great problem what should he do, Dick White turned out of the Strand and walked to the turnstile at Waterloo Bridge, thrusting his hand in his pocket as he did so. "No change. Pay as I come back," he said fiercely as he withdrew that hand, when the man glanced at him for a moment and then nodded, while Dick passed through with a click, click, click. It was broad daylight, and he was well dressed, though his coat was a little soiled with cigar ash, so that he did not look a candidate for 12 intelligent jurymen in a coroner's summing up. Such was the conclusion of the tollman, but all the same Dick White turned into a recess and sat down. What should he do? He was penniless and in debt, but, strange to say, the only debt that troubled him was the one he had just incurred for the sum of 1/2 penny, and possibly he would not have cared for that, only that its non-payment would give him, as his own sense might have told him it must, the trouble of crossing over to the Surrey side and getting back into fashionable regions via Westminster or Blackfriars Bridge. He argued, in the course of his meditations on the means of sustaining life, that man was made either to prey upon others or to be preyed upon, and therefore divisible into 2 classes. People could not prey upon him, save in a cannibal way, so he must perforce belong to the preyers, and he quietly resolved to accept his position and to begin to prey. But how? He could not lend money without capital, neither could he start in trade. Photography required apparatus as well as knowledge, and of late people had grown less anxious touching their carts. Could he start a company, drive a cab, sweep a crossing opposite his father's door, hold horses after investing in a red-sleeved waistcoat in Holywell Street? No, he couldn't take to any of these, at least not yet, but confound it, how cold these stones were. Dick White got up and walked across the bridge out into the Waterloo Road, cold and spiritless, for, in spite of what is said regarding the genial Christmas time, there is no more dreary day in the year than that devoted to boxing. Neither is the Waterloo Road a cheerful place at the best of times, and years back it wore the aspect of being a large gallery for the exhibitions of unsuccessful trades and traders. It was no wonder that Dick shivered as he hurried past a decayed mechanic selling matches in company with his family, and who addressed the schemer as "kind Christian friend," treading on one of the children's toes the next instant for looking after 2 boys running behind a cab, and only just in time, for the young mendicant had his lips parted to shout, "Whip behind!" If he had lived 100 years earlier, he might have invested in a black mask and a brace of pistols, taken to one of the outskirts as a footpad, and then won his way up to the honourable fame of a knight of the road, with a gallant horse of the Black Bess breed, and died nobly after a glorious career at Tyburn, while his biography would have been read, richly illustrated, in penny weekly numbers 2 and 3, presented gratis to purchasers of number 1. But then, Dick White did not live 100 years ago, for he was living at the time when the thought occurred to him, and once more he asked himself the still pending question, what should he do? He responded to the query that time out loud, and in a fierce way, and this is how he answered it: live by my wits. When they failed him, and he became bankrupt in his stock of assurance, he meant to attack the humble pie waiting for him at home, but not before. So, making the best of his way back to the Middlesex shore, he divested himself of his gold watch and chain, walked up and down a few streets till the familiar sign of the 3 golden pills of the Medici met his eye, the golden pills of those physicians whose medicaments are invaluable for the ills of the pocket, and, without giving way to the false shame which attacks so many, he rushed in, laid down watch and chain upon the counter, and demanded £15 thereon. And obtained the loan? No, but he received £12 less the price of the ticket, and 10 minutes after he was feasting royally on coffee and mutton chops, that is, royally as to appetite. 2 days after, an advertisement appeared in the Times advising all who required a good servant to apply at the Registration Company's office, West Audley Street, where servants of every description could be hired from 10 to 4. Those who paid the office a visit, seeking situation or servant, found Dick White, in blue spectacles, seated behind a large account book at a baize-covered table, taking fees and entering names. The walls were covered with neatly written notices relative to cooks, housemaids, ladies' maids, and footmen not under 6 feet in height, and for a whole month the institution seemed to be flourishing and the company likely to pay a dividend. But at the end of that time, when the police wished to make inquiries respecting the antecedents of a young lady who had been recommended to fill the situation of a nursery governess in a nobleman's family, the constable found the office closed, and the landlord ignorant as to the whereabouts of the company's secretary. In fact, the returns over and above the expenditure were so small that Dick White had dissolved the company and resolved upon trying something more congenial. He sought that something for the next few weeks in one of his favorite pursuits, to wit, billiards, but in that profession he soon found that there were too many needy adventurers, and, still low in pocket, he gave that up and turned his attention in other directions with constantly varying success. Dick owned to himself at this time that, had it not been for the newspapers, he must have starved. But once a happy thought occurred to him. Presto! 3 or 4 shillings spent in an advertisement, and it was being read throughout the length and breadth of the land. Somehow or another, he was always getting down to his last crown, and then, if in within reach, that particular recess on Waterloo Bridge was sought, in the hope that inspiration would come. He was seated there one hot day, smoking a cheap, very rank cigar, and trying in vain to think of something new. Every idea for getting a living seemed to have been worked up, every hole to be filled. He was low-spirited, and more than once told himself that he had better jump over and end all his troubles, but, like Hamlet, he had his doubts as to whether that act would end them, and, though heartily sick of being hard up, he was in no wise tired of life, which, on the whole, he found a very supportable state of thing. "Give it up for today," said Dick at last. "My muse is out of town. Bother the flies!" Smack came down Dick's hand upon an unfortunate insect that, after vainly attempting to effect lodgment upon his cheek, had taken to one knee, to be incorporated the next instant within the cloth. Apparently delighted with his successful blow, Dick repeated it upon the other knee, jumped up, ran to his lodging situated in Lyon's Inn, sat scribbling for 10 minutes or so, and then hurried away to 2 or 3 newspaper offices. And the next day people all over England who were troubled by the plague of flies that visits us towards the end of summer read with intense interest the advertisement of Professor Entomos's new patent fly destroyers, each one guaranteed to destroy 100 millions of flies, not sticky, offensive, or poisonous, one sent post-free upon the receipt of 13 postage stamps. 1 day and no application. 2 days, ditto, and, but for a lucky hit at the billiard table, Dick would once more have been hungry. That night he was rather low-spirited, and more than once his inner man whispered plainly of the old house in the by-street, but Dick was not yet hungry enough for the humble pie repast, and he was awakened the next morning by what seemed like a heavy pattering shower in the outer room. Patter, patter, patter. Something must be wrong. It was as if rain were falling upon the floor. Jumping out of bed and hurrying on his things, he at length peeped out to find that the shower was over. But Beneath the letter slit in the door lay a whole heap of missives that had come by the general post, one and all enclosing 13 postage stamps and an application for the destroyer of 100 millions of flies. Dick White smiled, the smile of conscious genius, and gathered up his letters. He breakfasted well that morning after changing his stamps for current coin of the realm, and then prepared, in all due honesty, to satisfy each applicant. But this was not done without a little labor, and a few instruction labels had to be printed. Dick worked hard, however, the toil acting as balm to his conscience, and, as he worked on, advertised again. While, the applications coming tumbling in, he began to look upon himself as a public benefactor, till such time as the cold winds of an early autumn set in. Nature herself sweeping away the flies, when for nearly a year Othello's occupation was gone, and, on casting up his gains, Dick had the satisfaction of finding that the advertising had taken nearly the whole of his profit. It may be as well, though, to explain the invention, one which must have given universal satisfaction, for the professor never had a complaint, save from a stationer in a country town, who evidently, moved by a desire to supply the invention wholesale, forwarded cash for a dozen, and, 2 days after receiving his parcel, intimated by post that unless the money were refunded per return, he should make application to the police. Under these circumstances, Dick White, having his father's example before his eyes, declared himself to be too busy to attend to legal matters, refunded the cash, and refrained from attending to subsequent wholesale orders, confining himself to the retail and full-price department. We were present when one applicant received the professor's destroyer, and on the wrapper, under £1/4 being opened, it was found to contain a piece of millboard of the size and shape of a razor strop, with the following instructions pasted thereon: "Spread a little powdered sugar upon the table of a room infested with flies. Wait till they congregate, then grasp the destroyer tightly by the handle, advance cautiously, and hit hard." Dick lived for months upon pills. Lung pills prepared from the recipe of a consumptive patient, the aforesaid recipe being made known as an act of gratitude, but those pills were so efficacious that no one ever required more than 1 box. He then invented a depilatory and a whisker producer, both prepared from precisely the same materials, but here again the advertising nearly ruined him. But, nothing daunted, he tried his hand at Christmas novelties, his being the brain that introduced to the public the bittered-aloed comfits, the gunpowdered candles, and a few other pleasing inventions of a similar character. Still, it was hand-to-mouth living, for none of his schemes were attended with the great success he anticipated. He advertised ways for getting a living, but still the stamps received all went to the various papers, and he who longed to benefit others at 12 stamps each could not benefit himself. It was plain that England did not appreciate him, and he determined upon making only 1 coup more and then leaving his mother country for the hospitable arms of France. He had had this grand project in petto for some time, but before putting it in force he had tried a few minor adaptations from the French, contracting for the orange peel at various theatres and places of amusement, supplying therewith a manufacture of candied peel and marmalade, Bonnie Dundee marmalade, celebrated and familiar to many, no doubt, for its gentle soupçon of sawdust, known to the eaters as a pine or pineapple flavour. A tobacco scheme which he originated was less successful. There was more difficulty in obtaining cigar ends, and, times being hard, people smoked their cigars exceedingly short. Otherwise the speculation must have proved very profitable, for the tobacco cut from the waste ends formed a fine-flavoured weed, particularly mild in the smoking, and was growing very popular under the name of Black Returns. There was a benevolence and prevention of waste in these latter projects that Dick considered to be highly creditable, but, as they did not bring him the profit he was justified in expecting, he turned his attention to his last English speculation, making arrangements for an immediate departure for La Belle France in case of failure. For the proper carrying out of his scheme, Dick took fresh apartments, finding them in the pleasant retirement of Brownlow Street, Holborn, and thence he sent simultaneously advertisements to 40 provincial papers, worded to the effect that a stepfather offered £100 to any respectable couple entirely without family who would adopt a little girl aged 10 months. Applicants to be of the Wesleyan persuasion and ready to produce unimpeachable references as to position in life and character, and to show that they would be prepared to act kindly and conscientiously to the child. Also, they were not moved by a desire merely to possess the offered premium. Applications to be addressed to Brownlow Street with references, when, if satisfactory, arrangements would be immediately made for an interview and the transfer of the child. But as the advertiser had been much troubled by irresponsible and fictitious personages to prove their good faith, applicants were requested to enclose 5 shillings in postage stamps, which would be returned in case of the negotiation being broken off. For the most part, the advertisements appeared on a Saturday. 5, however, were in a Friday edition, and 4 more were refused a place in the old established papers to which they were sent, the proprietors returning the stamps. The Saturday passed uneventfully, as did of course Sunday, but with the delivery of the General Post letters on Monday, Dick's scheme began to show fruit, the letters pouring in, almost without exception containing the stipulated 5 shillings in stamps. The amount of purity, religious sentiment, and benevolence in the provinces, as shown by these letters, was something startling. There was not one applicant who cared a rush for the £100, so long as the child, the sweet innocent denied to them after many years of matrimony, could be obtained. The general desire seemed to be to take the infant. The money was quite a secondary consideration, but still several of the writers were willing to take the £100 and invest it for the little one's benefit on coming of age. Scripture was quoted, and women compared themselves to Hannah or Sarah, while tears or drops of some kind had blotted out more than one letter. Sincere or not, the love, charity, benevolence, what you will, displayed were something marvelous. But unfortunately there was no child, and Dick White sat grimly smiling as he opened letter after letter and spread out the stamps, till a large note-case he had was crammed and its elastic band hard-pressed to perform its duty. Then came the task of burning the missives till the fire was filled with spark-dancing tinder, when Dick lit a cigar and sat and smoked, awaiting another post probably before commencing his replies. Another post, and another, brought him fresh applications from endless out-of-the-way country places on the Tuesday and Wednesday, and on the Friday evening Dick was sitting considering whether he should try the scheme in another part of the country, when the cigar dropped from his fingers, and his heavy pale face turned to an ashy hue, for there was a strange knock at the door before, and a woman's voice in parley with the visitor. Now, to anyone living in lodgings, there is nothing so very startling in a quiet knock, or the sound of a man's voice speaking to whoever opens, but all the same there was trouble depicted on Richard White's countenance. The great beads stood upon his brow, and, creeping across the floor, he locked his door, darted through into the bedroom and did the same there, and then, coming back, he buckled the strap of a small leather bag over his shoulders, took 2 square packets from a table and buttoned them securely up in his coat, put on his overcoat and hat, and then stood listening in the dark, just as steps were ascending the stairs and someone knocked at his door. He stood, not daring to breathe aloud while the knock was repeated twice.
"Perhaps he's gone out,"
said the landlady from below.
"Will you leave any message?"
"Thank you, I'll wait," said a voice, and a strange feeling of nervous trembling came upon Dick White. He had no business with anyone in London that should bring a visitor to these apartments, for they were not known to a soul. The business, then, must be respecting the advertisements, and what was the visitor's purpose? Dick White knew, and he strode silently to the window lit up by gas lamps down in the street. There were not many people visible, but there was a policeman, and Dick could hardly suppress a groan as he saw that there was no escape there. He turned from the window and was softly stealing back when he became aware of a faint tearing noise, as of a mouse busy with its teeth upon the grain of wood, and for a few moments he stood wondering, but the next instant understood the meaning of the noise, and, carefully drawing the cover from the table, he hung it upon a peg behind the door, letting its folds fall softly over a moving spot of bright steel which twinkled and shone just where a ray of light fell from the street lamp. That act saved him from being seen, for whoever was outside had been cautiously boring a hole through the door with a gimlet so as to make a spot for observation, but so far the plan was frustrated. Dick heard the sound of the withdrawn gimlet, then an impatient ejaculation, followed by a sharp summons.
"Is anyone at home here?"
said the same voice. No answer.
"Now, sir, have the goodness to open this door. It's of no use. The game's up, and I know you're there."
No answer, only Dick's heart palpitating fiercely. What a fool he was, he thought, not to have gone away an hour sooner, content with what he had done, instead of waiting to be taken, for he knew that this last scheme was one which brought him within the pale of the law. But it was too late to repent now, and all his scheming energy was directed to a way for making his escape.
"Am I to break your door down?"
said the same voice.
"I know you're there. Your key is inside. If the door is not opened in 5 minutes, I shall have it forced." "That you just won't do nothing of the kind, so I tell you,"
says the voice of the landlady.
"In the Queen's name, ma'am," replied the first speaker. "The Queen don't pay my rates and taxes and rent and outgoings for repairs," said the landlady in crescendo. "And if you want my lodger, young man, you'll have to wait till he opens his door."
"Step up here, will you?" exclaimed the same voice, and Dick heard a heavy foot upon the stairs. What was he to do? Was he to be taken here like a rat in a cage? What an ass! What an idiot! With all his scheming, not to have had the sense of a beast of the field and provided a means of escape, a second outlet to his lair. The back window looked out upon a small enclosed yard, which would be only a second trap if he threw open the sash and dropped in it, perhaps to break a limb in so doing. There was expostulation for a few minutes outside, then the firm voice of the law, and lastly, as if to quicken his steps, the door was fiercely shaken. Could he hide himself? There was the chimney, but he turned from that with a bitter smile, knowing that it would only afford him a hole from which he would be ignominiously dragged. Crash! They were in earnest, and the frail old door would not stand many more such shocks. What could he do? Could he not scheme anything after all? He stepped on tiptoe to the window and peered out. There were only the ordinary passengers, and so far they evidently had not learned that there was a police raid. There was not even the constable on the street now, and, quick as thought, just as another crash came at the door, one which nearly burst off the lock, Dick White softly raised the sash of the front window and stepped out onto the great moulding over the shop below. But as he did so, he gave the alarm by dislodging a couple of flower pots, sending them with a loud crash upon the pavement. There was not a moment to lose. He was dressed ready for starting. He had his treasure and stamps safely secured. There was a street lamp only a few feet from him, and with a bold leap he cleared the distance, catching and hanging on to the iron ladder bar for an instant to swing violently to and fro, and then he dropped to the ground and ran north, just as there was a rush of feet and the old and familiar cry of "Stop, thief!" But Dick White was determined not to be taken easily. He ran to the end of the street, turned to the right, and doubled down Warwick Court, crossed Holborn unstayed, and down Chancery Lane, an ever-increasing tail of pursuers panting and thronging behind him, the inherent love of hunting growing stronger each moment in the British mind. One man who, hearing the cry of "Stop, thief!" tried to stop him, Dick caught right in the chest and rolled him over onto the pavement, where he lay just in time to trip up the foremost policeman, another pursuer falling as well. On went Dick, panting but warming to the work. At that time of night, Chancery Lane was a dreary, empty way, and there was a free course for the fugitive, who dodged to the next opposer of his liberty. But the sound of the pursuit rang echoing down the lane, unchecked by the distant roars of Fleet Street and Holborn, the latter each moment growing more distant as the other seemed to increase. More and more empty the lane seemed to grow as he raced on, and no one took up the chase, but for all that Dick knew that it was only a question of time. The appearance of a fresh policeman on the scene would be almost fatal, and the crowded street below would certainly ensure his capture. Still, he was not taken yet, and a good dozen yards were between him and his next pursuer. He made then as if to go straight down the lane, but doubled onto Carey Street, then rushed fiercely down Bell Yard, to the upsetting of a couple of law clerks bent on oysters, but who, in revenge, took up the chase as the runner, still followed by the ringing cries, dodged amongst the traffics, through Temple Bar, along the Strand, towards St. Clement's Churchyard, down Devereux Street, out into Essex Street, and, still followed, ran on at full speed. Had thoughts of the old house come upon him, and did he mean to double again, and make, in his dire extremity, for his father's door? No. Dick White's blood was up now. He was growing desperate, and could he have seized a couple of those yelling, insensate hounds who strove, ignorant of his offense, to run him down, he would have tried to strangle them without compunction. His breath came thick and fast, and he knew that he could go little further. There was a burning sensation in his chest, and the taste as of blood in his mouth, but he would run till he dropped, though could he reach the bottom of the street, there were the steps, and if the tide were down, he might hide amongst the barges, or escape somewhere through the mud. "Stop thief! Stop thief!" echoing down the street, and an organ playing an air from an opera stopped as if by magic. A man darted from a doorway to arrest the hunted one, but he had better have refrained, for a fierce blow sent him into the road, where his head struck with sickening violence upon the granite paving, and by the time he was sitting up, giddy and confused, Dick was at the steps. Running down, he reached the gangway of the steamboat pier, but only to groan as he saw to his dismay that the tide was up. There was no retreat, for his pursuers were close upon him. What was it to be, a prison and disgrace, or the river? Dick White was no coward, and without a moment's hesitation he ran along, down the floating pier, giving a glance out to where the lights flashed on the dark flowing stream, with the tide running down fast. Then there was a loud shout of horror from behind, a bold leap, a plash, and Dick was swimming strongly out towards the middle of the river. It was bold, but it was the only way to safety, and he smiled bitterly, with the muddy water bubbling at his lip, as he heard his pursuers' shouts for the Thames police galley, and he knew that he must already be out of their sight. Then he thought of Waterloo Bridge and the recess, then of his plunder and postage stamps, and of the water spoiling them, then of his life, for he felt that he could not keep afloat long, exhausted as he was. The next moment he saw below him the mooring lights of a couple of river steamers anchored for the night, and, striking out to reach them, he was swept on by the tide, sinking lower and lower each instant, till, feeling that his last effort had been made, he opened his mouth to cry for help, sank beneath the surface, rose again, and then, with despairing, clutching hand, he grasped at, and his fingers closed upon, the looped chain festooned along the bows of the river boats, and hung there for a good quarter of an hour, till somewhat recovered, he tried to draw himself up and climb on board, a feat which he did not accomplish till almost worn out, when he fell down on the deck and lay motionless. Half an hour later, shivering with the cold, Dick White was cautiously seeking for a way of escape from his new prison, finding it at last in the shape of a small boat, which, drawing up by the painter, he stepped into, and, seizing the sculls, was rowing away just as there came a hail from the steamer he had left. But it was too late. Dick had made his escape, and after proceeding a distance down the river, he landed at some dark and gloomy-looking stairs near London Bridge, shook and wrung off as much water as he could, and making his way along the most secluded streets, he had an accomplice in the shape of a soaking shower which effectively screened him. Then he sought a bed at a public house, where he had ample excuse for sending his clothes to be dried, the landlady declaring, though, that she never saw anyone so soaked before. Dick had the pleasure of reading an account of his death next morning over his breakfast, the report describing him as a notorious swindler and narrating his drowning with minute exactness. The police were pretty sharp, but they did not know the man they had sought, for with the exercise of a little caution Dick was able to change his unspoiled stamps, and feeling now that the time had come for bidding farewell to England, he made his way to the London Bridge terminus one morning, and the next saw him in Paris, bent upon scheming honestly for some way of gaining his livelihood, for he owned to himself that his last plan did savour somewhat of swindling, and that he had had a narrow escape of bringing down dishonour upon the pure white escutcheon. Dick White spoke French like a native, as the saying is. That is to say, he had learned it thoroughly, or had it well drummed into his head at school, forgotten 7/8 of it, and picked it up again amongst the French billiard players in the neighbourhood of Leicester Square, so that he had no difficulty in settling down in his new abode, which welcomed him with open arms upon his commencing in a new line, for, whatever may have been attempted previously, Dick White's was the genuine institution. Upon quietly settling down, he had again racked his brains as to the way in which he should employ his small capital, revolving every human weakness before his mind in turn. Patent medicines were analyzed by government. Shady trades were too much under police supervision. The French billiard players were too skillful. What should he do? What pursuit was there in which he could make the national character subservient to his ends? The idea came, as did that for the fly-papers, with a flash, and before the week was out, the bureau of Monsieur Blanc was, if not in full operation, commencing business after this wise. The bureau of Monsieur Blanc was elegantly furnished, and callers were ushered in by a most carefully attired Lacroix. "Madame wished to see me?" said Dick, rising to place a chair for a stout lady in half-mourning. Madame had seen the avis of Monsieur Blanc in the journal. "Précisément. Would Madame kindly furnish Monsieur Blanc with a few particulars to enter into the little book before him, bound in white satin with gilt-edged leaves?" Madame hesitated. Madame may be perfectly candid with Monsieur Blanc, whose negotiations were conducted with the strictest secrecy and in perfect bonne foi. Her feelings should in no way be outraged. "But remuneration?" Madame suggested. "Ah, a secondary consideration entirely. Monsieur Blanc, in the event of a happy matrimonial engagement being effected, might ask a percentage upon the lady's dot, or he might be content with the presents made to him by the happy pair. Voilà tout." Madame was satisfied, and Monsieur Blanc rode on. 8,000 francs per annum in rent, widow, etc., etc., and her wishes? Madame wished a perfect gentleman, fortune no object, but a title would be an acquisition. And soon after she was bowed out, trying to blush as, like a soft cloud over the sun, her thick veil was allowed to fall. 2 days had not elapsed before there was a titleless gentleman on the books of Monsieur Blanc, who, on consideration of 8,000 francs of rent, did not object to a lately slightly vulgar, and possessed of the attributes known in our non-ethereal Saxon tongue as fat, fair, and 40. Dick did very well with the contract between Monsieur Hyacinthe de la Pierre and the Veuve Brome. The presents he received from the stout dame were substantial as her sweet self. Moreover, she confided to him that Monsieur son mari was adorable. Their acquaintance formed an introduction to a certain class of society, and Monsieur Blanc dined out frequently. The de la Pierres, too, were his references on more than one charming matrimonial project, and matters went on flowing so smoothly that Dick White rubbed his soft hands and told himself that fortune was smiling upon him at last. In fact, his matrimonial agency worked so well that he made up his mind to become a candidate for, or rather a purchaser of, his own goods, scanning carefully the appearance and prospects of each first-class fair applicant for the honors of matrimony. For Monsieur Blanc classified his visitors into first, second, and third class according to their means, such trifles as age, appearance, temper, or accomplishments being left out of the question. But for some time no suitable lady presented herself. Dick had introduced to each other and seen married couples by the score, but not one lady seemed suited for himself, and he grew somewhat discouraged. But he was hopeful still. Matters were working right, he thought, and he had only to wait, when one evening a Monsieur Bernard was announced. Would he take a chair? "Certainly, but, my dear sir," the visitor exclaimed, "I have not come on this sort of business." "But you were introduced with a card of my friends the de la Pierres." "To be sure, they are old friends of mine. I dine there tonight, in fact, and Madame is au despero. She sent me to ask your aid." "In what way can I serve her?" said Dick White with dignity, as with true insular care he involuntarily buttoned his pockets. "You know the strange superstition. Our chère Madame invited 14 to dinner, and 1 has sent word he cannot come. 13 is unlucky, and Madame is in agony unless you will make the 14th. "Is that all?" said Dick. "Yes, that is all," said Monsieur Bernard. "I'll be there," said Dick, to whom a new idea had occurred. "But may I not place your name upon my books, monsieur?" "Ah, ma foi! I married an English Miss these long years ago, but time presses. Adieu." "Bye-bye," said Dick nonchalantly. And half an hour after he was introduced to a young French lady of 33, whom he led down to dinner in his character of 14e, and, warned by Madame de la Pierre's whisper respecting her handsome dot, the chef de bureau lost no time in trying to transact business. He knew a gentleman that he felt sure Mademoiselle would love, could she but read his heart. Mademoiselle blushed and allowed herself to be led during the course of the evening to a side drawing-room, where Dick was indefatigable in his attentions, for the lady, as he owned to himself, might have been worse. True, if he waited, something better might turn up, but a little thought made him quote to himself a few of the old English aphorisms, "A bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush," "Strike while the iron is hot," etc., and he had made up his mind matrimonially, provided Celestine Chalet could be brought into the same way of thinking. The time was short, but Dick made the most of it, and there certainly was a slight pressure in return as he held her hand and assisted her to the carriage. Would she visit the bureau? She dared not. She had a reason. And that reason? Papa! Was someone then to be left in despair? They say drowning men catch at straws, and surely sometimes ladies, swamped in the great slough of old maidism, are found to snatch at any hand that offers. At all events it was so here, for the carriage drove off with the words ringing in Dick White's, otherwise Monsieur Blanc's, ears, that it was possible that a call might be made upon cette chère Madame de la Pierre during the next afternoon. A fortune equivalent in English money to 1,400 a year. And the lady? Well, her manners weren't bad, and the weaker vessel was not expected to be strong. Dick White was cruel enough to say that there was a slight flaw or crack in that vessel, but nevertheless he persevered with his suit, and the meetings at Madame de la Pierre's grew frequent, to the neglect of the bureau, 2 or 3 contracts being settled between unsuitable people, Monsieur Blanc having so far forgotten himself as to neglect the proper inquiries, the effect being that Monsieur A, professing to have so many francs of income, espoused Madame B of similar pretensions. The same was the case with Messieurs C and D, who were introduced to Mesdames E and F, and before many days were over, the whole of the contracting parties were assailing Monsieur Blanc, whom they charged with swindling them, since each couple proved to be absolutely penniless. Proper acumen would have avoided such unpleasantries, but Monsieur Blanc's time had been taken up to such an extent with the door of the fair Celestine that he did not see the deceit practiced, and all he could do was to advise his self-deceiving clients to let love fill the place they expected to be occupied by money, and then avoid further unpleasantries by closing the bureau, pro tem, of course, or until the visits of the disappointed contractors had ceased. Meanwhile, to avoid rust, Dick White publicly announced his readiness to fill the post of quatorzième at dinners generally, and by slow degrees began to acquire a connection. The task was pleasant, the dinners and wines generally good. He had a ready flow of conversational power, and if the 14th party, the exorciser of the spirit of ill luck, had been required more frequently, the profession would have been most satisfactory. Time flew on, and the visits to Madame de la Pierre's were not without result. The fair Celestine grew more and more willing to listen to her courtier's suit, and at last matters were brought to a climax. "Papa is so cruel," sobbed the maiden one day when, by accident, Madame de la Pierre had been called from the room. "He wishes me to espouse Monsieur le Baron Longueville." "But you will not," whispered Dick earnestly. "Que voulez-vous?" sobbed the lady. "What can I do?" Dick White's words grew very low and earnest, and there were references made to flight, England, a few weeks to gain papa's forgiveness, and then, with the rather bony form of the fair Celestine clasped in his arms, the contract was about to be sealed by a salute, when the door was opened, and, as the lady shrieked the word "Papa!" a yellow little man, furious with passion, dashed into the room. There were a few angry words passed, there was a stick raised, and Monsieur Blanc received a sharp cut across the cheek. The next moment the lady swooned, but not before she had seen the hot blood of the Englishman triumph over his discretion, and papa rolled over upon the carpet by a blow from the shoulder. It took 6 months of plotting before Dick White could gain an interview and once more win over the lady to his wishes. But all was at length settled, and one night a fiacre was seen waiting at the door in a retired street. The hour was at hand, and Dick White, muffled and cloaked, sat inside waiting. At last, then, success was to attend him. The lady, closely disguised, was to descend and enter the fiacre, and, with his heiress in her own right, Dick felt that he could set fortune at defiance. There was the sound of the door opening. Her figure was seen descending the steps, and, turning the handle of the fiacre, Dick leaned forward, when 2 sergeants de ville stepped up, one to escort the lady back, the other to take his seat by Dick to give some instructions to the driver, and then the vehicle was driven away. Police surveillance in Paris is painful. Therefore it is not surprising that the next month found Richard White, once more as Monsieur Blanc, practicing his new profession of quatorzième, but after all, it was but a poor trade, and a great many days did Mr. White go dinnerless. Thus at length he was obliged to try something else, and that failing, and yet another speck failing after that, he once more turned his face toward the land of his birth. "I wonder what will happen next," said Dick, as he set foot in London. He little thought what a surprising event was about to occur. That first story is very Dickensian, isn't it? And I'm always amazed at how these types of stories put children in real harm's way. That poor kid wandering around London by himself all night in January. I think it's an interesting twist that he's a poor child who is for some reason raised as a rich one. I feel like we're always reading stories that are the other way around. I wonder why Tusher takes him in this way. I don't get that. As for the second story, yes, of course, Dick White would have to come around again after the first chapter. What a weird character progression. On the one hand, I admire his independence and his desire to make it on his own, and he's got a lot of resourcefulness and entrepreneurial spirit, of course. On the other hand, he's a scammer. I mean, at first kind of a borderline scammer, and then he really is a scammer, and he's a very morally ambiguous character. Actually, almost all these characters are morally ambiguous. They're all kind of likable and unlikable, relatable and unrelatable. I want to think about this more at the end of this series, which is in the next video, where we'll talk a little bit more also about the origin of Tinsley's magazine and this Christmas annual. If you listen all the way to the end of the video, you get to hear me make a little confession. Tonight's confession is that, of course, Christmas makes me a little sentimental. I think I was lucky. I'm an only child, and I was an only grandchild until I was like 10 or 11. So those early Christmases were really focused on me. Like all the big presents were for me. I noticed that adults who like Christmas always had nice Christmases as a kid, and adults who don't like Christmas did not have good ones as a kid. By the way, if you're one of those, I think it would be healthy to find some ways to create a Christmas that is yours as an adult that you can enjoy. I know too many people who just retreat from the whole thing and feel awkward and resentful for all of December. But one of the nice things about being an adult is that we don't have to continue operating on the same set of instructions. We can make new ideas for ourselves. It's just a thought, anyway. I did want to talk about nice Christmas memories. I was remembering that I was sometimes allowed to sleep on the couch with the Christmas tree and the Christmas lights, and how much I loved that colorful glow and snoozing like that. And I was remembering that my grandparents had a kind of small sofa that was just like two conjoined recliners. Do you know what I mean? Like two chairs that reclined independently and had independent footrests and like back tilts, but there was no third arm in between them, so that it was like a single piece of furniture. Anyway, when I was small, I was allowed to sit up there in between them, and it was just like a hard, awkward ridge in the furniture. There wasn't any padding or anything because nobody was supposed to sit there, but it was so cool to sit up high and snug in between them, and I just loved being up there. My grandparents also had a big old media console to hold their giant CRT TV, and one of the little cupboards in it was set aside just for me, so whenever we came to visit for the holidays, or actually any time, there were new coloring books and candies and little toys and doodads in that cupboard for me. And I mean, you know, all of it. The smell of those like rough, nasty, old-fashioned cigarettes just embedded in every surface, and this extremely regular, regimented schedule of my grandparents' lives and their terrible, nasty, yappy little dog. And it's so funny that all of that reminds me of Christmas too. So, tell me in the comments what odd, unlikely detail sticks in your memory and makes you think of Christmas. If you like old stories and odd, unlikely details, you're one of us. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Please also like this video and drop me a comment below. I love finding out what you think, and it really does help other people find the channel. If you want to contribute even more, consider using the link in the description to buy me a cup of coffee. Thank you so much for all your support, and I will see you for the conclusion of this epic series in a few days.